Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation of Trust. Clint Hodges had always believed in loyalty above all else. It was a principle forged in the crucible of 12 years serving as a Marine Corps intelligence specialist, where betrayal meant death and trust was the currency that kept you alive. When he met Paula McElroy at a Veterans Charity Gala in Denver 6 years ago, her warm smile and infectious laugh had seemed like the perfect antidote to the cold, calculating world he'd left behind. Paula was everything Clint thought he wanted: beautiful, charming, and from a well-established family. Her father, Herbert McElroy, owned a successful chain of automotive dealerships across Colorado, and her social connections opened doors that Clint's military pension and private security consulting business never could. They married within 18 months, and Paula brought 2 children from her previous marriage, Curtis, now 16, and Dee, 14. Clint had embraced fatherhood with the same methodical precision he'd applied to intelligence gathering overseas. He attended every soccer game, helped with homework, and transformed the family's modest suburban home into something worthy of Paula's social aspirations. He'd liquidated his military savings and investments to fund renovations, private schools, and a lifestyle Paula claimed was necessary for the children's future. The first crack in the foundation appeared 8 months ago when Clint noticed Paula's behavior changing. Late nights at charity functions, mysterious phone calls that ended abruptly when he entered the room, and a sudden interest in fitness that required daily visits to an upscale gym across town. But Clint was patient. Surveillance had taught him that premature action often yielded incomplete intelligence. Marshall Chamberlain entered their lives as Paula's personal trainer, a smooth-talking former college athlete with perfectly styled hair and an expensive smile. He was everything Clint wasn't: flashy, social, and unencumbered by the weight of real responsibility. Marshall drove a leased BMW, lived in a downtown loft, and spoke in the kind of motivational buzzwords that Paula seemed to find inspirational. "He's helping me become the best version of myself," Paula would say, her eyes bright with an enthusiasm Clint hadn't seen directed toward him in years. Clint's military instincts screamed warnings, but he maintained discipline. He began what he called passive reconnaissance, the kind of patient observation that had once helped him track enemy movements across Afghan mountainsides. He noted times, patterns, inconsistencies. Paula's training sessions lasted 3 hours, but her gym's records showed she checked out after 90 minutes. Her phone battery somehow died during every session, making her unreachable. Credit card statements revealed charges at restaurants and hotels on days she claimed to be at her book club. The children, too, began exhibiting signs of divided loyalty. Curtis, once eager to discuss football strategy with Clint, became sullen and dismissive. Dee stopped asking for help with her math homework, preferring to figure out herself. Family dinners became exercises in polite conversation, punctuated by meaningful glances between Paula and the kids, glances that excluded Clint entirely. Herbert McElroy's attitude toward Clint had never been warm, but lately it had turned openly contemptuous. The old man made pointed comments about real men and providers during family gatherings, always with Paula nodding along sympathetically. It was clear that whatever story Paula was telling her family about their marriage, Clint was cast as the villain. 3 months ago, Clint's suspicions crystallized into certainty. Using skills honed in military intelligence, he'd installed discreet surveillance equipment in Paula's car and began monitoring her digital footprint. The evidence was overwhelming. Lengthy text exchanges with Marshall filled with explicit content, hotel room receipts, and a detailed discussion about their future together once Paula figured out the Clint situation. But the betrayal ran deeper than simple adultery. Paula and Marshall weren't just planning an affair. They were planning Clint's complete destruction. Text messages revealed their scheme. Paula would file for divorce, claiming emotional abuse and financial control. She'd already consulted with an aggressive divorce attorney who specialized in protecting women from manipulative veterans with PTSD. The children had been coached to support her version of events, describing Clint as distant, controlling, and potentially dangerous. Marshall's role was more than just lover. He was the architect of Clint's social destruction. Using his connections in Denver's fitness and wellness community, he'd been spreading rumors about Clint's violent past and unstable behavior. The goal was to isolate Clint completely, making him appear unfit for custody and unworthy of sympathy. The most devastating revelation came in a recorded phone conversation between Paula and her divorce attorney. She planned to claim that Clint had threatened her, using his military background to paint him as a dangerous individual who shouldn't have access to firearms or custody of children. The attorney assured her that judges were very sympathetic to women fleeing potentially violent veterans, and that she could expect to keep the house, receive substantial alimony, and maintain primary custody. As Clint absorbed this intelligence, something cold and familiar settled into his chest. The same predatory calm he'd felt when hunting enemy targets overseas. These people had made a critical miscalculation. They'd assumed that Clint's quiet demeanor indicated weakness, that his devotion to family meant he was soft. They'd forgotten that the most dangerous predators are often the ones that appear most docile. Sitting in his basement office, surrounded by evidence of their betrayal, Clint began planning his response. This wouldn't be an emotional reaction or a desperate attempt to save his marriage. This would be a precision operation designed to completely destroy his enemies while protecting his own interests. He'd given Paula, Marshall, and their allies every opportunity to demonstrate loyalty. They'd chosen betrayal instead. Now, they would learn what happened when you betrayed a man who'd spent years perfecting the art of warfare. Chapter 2: The Thanksgiving Gambit. Clint's preparation for Thanksgiving had been meticulous. For 3 months, he'd allowed Paula and Marshall to believe their deception was working, playing the role of the oblivious husband while gathering intelligence and positioning his pieces on the board. Today would mark the beginning of their destruction, but it had to appear spontaneous, a moment of organic revelation rather than a calculated strike. The McElroy family Thanksgiving was a grand affair, held at Herbert's sprawling ranch-style home in the exclusive Highlands Ranch community. Paula's extended family gathered annually for this performance of domestic perfection. Successful children, accomplished spouses, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from belonging to Denver's established middle class. Clint arrived bearing gifts and wearing his most convincing smile. He embraced Herbert with appropriate warmth, complimented Paula's sister Rosemary on her new hairstyle, and made polite conversation about sports and weather. To any observer, he appeared to be the devoted husband and stepfather, grateful to be included in such an accomplished family. Paula was radiant, dressed in a burgundy dress that Clint recognized as newly purchased, one of many recent expenses that Marshall had influenced. She moved through the gathering with practiced grace, accepting compliments and orchestrating conversations with the skill of someone who'd never questioned her position as the family's golden child. Marshall's presence was explained as a family friend. He'd apparently been invited by Herbert himself, who'd been impressed by the young man's business acumen and positive influence on Paula's health journey. Marshall worked the room like a politician, charming Paula's aunts with fitness advice and discussing investment strategies with her male cousins. He was careful to maintain appropriate distance from Paula in public, but Clint noticed the subtle touches, the meaningful glances, the way Marshall's eyes followed Paula's movements. Curtis and Dee had embraced their roles as supporting players in Paula's drama. They were polite but distant with Clint, demonstrating the kind of subtle disrespect that would be invisible to casual observers but devastating to a stepfather's authority. When Clint attempted to engage Curtis in conversation about his recent wrestling match, the boy's responses were monosyllabic and dismissive. Dee actually rolled her eyes when Clint offered to help her set the table. The performance reached its crescendo as dinner was served. Paula had orchestrated the seating arrangements to perfection. Clint found himself relegated to a folding chair at the corner of the extended table, physically separated from the family's main conversations. Herbert presided from the head of the table, with Marshall seated to his right, a position traditionally reserved for sons-in-law. Paula sat beside Marshall, close enough for private conversations, but distant enough to maintain plausible deniability. As the family shared their traditional gratitude speeches, the subtext became crystal clear. Herbert expressed appreciation for the young people who are building bright futures, his eyes fixed on Marshall. Paula spoke about finding the strength to pursue my dreams, while glancing at Marshall with poorly concealed affection. Curtis thanked his grandfather for showing me what real leadership looks like, pointedly avoiding any mention of Clint's guidance. The final insult came as dessert was being served. Paula approached Clint with a paper plate, the kind used for children's birthday parties, and spoke loudly enough for the entire room to hear, "Eat outside on the ground." Her tone carried the authority of someone confident in her support system. Herbert's grin was unmistakable as he added, "Men like you don't belong here." The old man's satisfaction was palpable. This was his moment of triumph, the definitive expulsion of someone he'd never considered worthy of his daughter. Clint looked around the table at the faces of people he'd tried to love and protect. Curtis and Dee sat frozen, not looking up from their plates, but their stillness was telling. They'd known this was coming. Even the family cat, a pampered Persian named Princess, had been given a velvet cushion on an unused chair, highlighting Clint's degraded status. The room fell silent as Clint slowly stood, his movements controlled and deliberate. He reached for his coat, taking his time as if considering his options. Then he leaned toward Paula, close enough that his words would be heard by everyone present. "Look under the table," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that made people obey without question. As Clint walked toward the door, he heard the scraping of chairs as family members looked beneath the dining table. Paula's sharp intake of breath told him she'd found what he'd left for her. A manila envelope containing printed copies of every text message she'd exchanged with Marshall over the past 3 months, along with hotel receipts, photographs, and a detailed timeline of their affair. But that was only the beginning. The envelope also contained copies of Paula's consultation notes with her divorce attorney, including her planned accusations of domestic violence and her strategy for claiming Clint was mentally unstable. Most damaging of all were transcripts of recorded conversations where Paula and Marshall discussed their contempt for Clint and their excitement about spending his money once they'd successfully destroyed him in court. The silence behind him was deafening as Clint stepped into the cool November air. He could imagine the chaos erupting in the dining room as family members absorbed the evidence of Paula's betrayal. Herbert's carefully constructed narrative about his daughter's unhappy marriage would crumble as he realized the truth. Paula wasn't the victim of an inadequate husband, but the architect of an elaborate deception. Marshall would be scrambling to explain his presence at a family gathering where he'd been secretly planning to destroy the host's son-in-law. The other family members would be reevaluating every conversation, every subtle criticism of Clint they'd accepted as truth. Curtis and Dee would be confronting the reality that their mother had used them as weapons against a man who tried to love them. But this revelation was merely the opening move in a larger game. Clint had spent months preparing for this moment, and Paula's public humiliation at her family's Thanksgiving table was just the beginning of her education in the cost of betrayal. As he drove away from the McElroy family home, Clint allowed himself a small smile. For 3 months, he'd endured their condescension and contempt, playing the role of the unsuspecting victim while building an intelligence picture that would ensure their complete destruction. The war had begun, and his enemies had just learned that they'd been fighting a battle they'd already lost. Chapter 3: The Intelligence Network. Clint's basement office had been transformed into a military-grade command center over the past 3 months. Multiple monitors displayed financial records, social media profiles, and surveillance footage. Detailed dossiers on Paula, Marshall, and their associates lined the walls like enemy target profiles. This wasn't the desperate obsession of a betrayed husband. This was the methodical preparation of a professional operator executing a precision mission. The morning after Thanksgiving, Clint received the call he'd been expecting. Paula's voice was shaking with rage as she screamed accusations through the phone. He was sick, he was stalking her, he was dangerous. She'd already filed for a restraining order and moved in with her sister Rosemary. The divorce papers would be served within days. You think you're so smart, Paula hissed. My lawyer says what you did was illegal surveillance. You'll be lucky if you don't go to prison. Clint listened calmly, making notes of her threats and emotional state. Is there anything else you'd like to say? He asked with professional detachment. Stay away from me and my children, Paula snapped before ending the call. Her children. That phrase crystallized something in Clint's mind. For 2 years, he'd considered Curtis and Dee his own children, loving them despite their increasingly distant behavior. But Paula's claim of ownership made their betrayal clear. They'd always seen him as an outsider, tolerated only as long as he served their purposes. The restraining order was served that afternoon by Deputy Lee Keenan, a man Clint recognized from Veterans Association meetings. Lee was professional but apologetic, clearly uncomfortable with the assignment. This doesn't seem right, Clint, Lee said quietly as he handed over the papers. I've known you for 3 years. You're not the kind of man who terrorizes women. Perception management, Clint replied, scanning the legal document. Create a narrative where I'm the aggressor, and suddenly her affair becomes self-defense. Lee glanced around nervously before leaning closer. There's something else. I've been hearing rumors about you around the department, stories about violent behavior and instability. Someone's been feeding information to certain officers, painting you as a potential domestic violence case. This confirmed Clint's suspicions about Marshall's network. The fitness instructor had connections throughout Denver's professional community, including several police officers who used his gym. Marshall had been methodically poisoning Clint's reputation with law enforcement, creating a foundation for Paula's claims of abuse. I appreciate the heads up, Clint said, making mental notes about information warfare tactics being used against him. After Lee departed, Clint reviewed the restraining order with professional interest. Paula's attorney had crafted a narrative portraying Clint as a dangerous veteran with PTSD who'd been monitoring his wife's activities and making threats. The order prohibited Clint from contacting Paula, approaching her workplace, or coming within 500 feet of the children's school. But Paula had made a crucial error. She'd underestimated Clint's network and resources. While she'd been building her case against him, Clint had been constructing his own intelligence operation. Saul Hammond had been Clint's communications specialist during their deployment in Afghanistan. Now a cybersecurity consultant in Denver, Saul possessed skills that made him invaluable for information gathering. Over the past 2 months, Saul had been conducting what he called digital archaeology on Paula and Marshall's lives. Your wife's been sloppy, Saul reported during their evening meeting at a discreet coffee shop downtown. She thinks deleting text messages makes them disappear, but cloud backups are forever. I've recovered everything going back 18 months. The recovered communications revealed the true scope of Paula and Marshall's deception. Their affair had begun over a year ago, meaning that much of Clint's recent marriage had been an elaborate performance. More disturbing were discussions about accelerating the timeline. Once Paula learned about Clint's substantial military life insurance policy and the equity he'd built in their home. Marshall's background check revealed additional concerning information. He'd been fired from his previous gym for inappropriate relationships with married clients, and his expensive lifestyle was funded largely by loans and credit cards. Marshall wasn't just pursuing Paula romantically. He was positioning himself to access her anticipated divorce settlement. There's more, Saul continued, sliding a tablet across the table. I've been monitoring Marshall's communications with a woman named Alice Yu. She's a divorce attorney who specializes in what she calls strategic victim positioning. The messages between Marshall and Alice Yu revealed a disturbing pattern. Marshall had done this before, targeting vulnerable married women, encouraging affairs, then connecting them with Yu's services to maximize divorce settlements. Paula wasn't Marshall's first victim, and she wouldn't be his last unless someone stopped him. Eric Robbins, Clint's former squad leader, had contributed his own expertise to the intelligence operation. Now working as a private investigator, Eric had been conducting physical surveillance on Marshall and documenting his activities. Guy's got a routine, Eric reported during their briefing session. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he meets with 3 other women at different locations around the city. All married, all wealthy, all convinced they're his only special client. The surveillance revealed Marshall's broader operation. He was simultaneously pursuing affairs with multiple married women, while Alice prepared their divorce cases. It was a sophisticated con game designed to maximize financial returns while destroying families. But Clint's most valuable intelligence asset was someone Paula would never suspect: her own sister, Rosemary Bray. Rosemary had approached Clint quietly the day after Thanksgiving, disturbed by what she'd witnessed at their family gathering. Unlike the rest of the McElroy family, Rosemary had always appreciated Clint's stability and his devotion to the children. She'd been suspicious of Paula's claims about marital problems and Marshall's sudden prominence in their family circle. "I know my sister," Rosemary confided during their clandestine meeting at a park near her home. "She's selfish and impulsive, but she's not cruel. Someone's been influencing her, making her believe things about you that aren't true." Rosemary agreed to serve as Clint's eyes and ears within the McElroy family, reporting on Paula's activities and emotional state. More importantly, she had access to Curtis and Dee, who'd been staying with her since Paula moved out of the family home. "The kids are confused," Rosemary reported. "They keep asking when they're going home, when they'll see you again. Paula tells them you're dangerous, but they don't understand why. Curtis found the papers you left at Thanksgiving and read some of the messages. He's been asking difficult questions that Paula can't answer." This intelligence confirmed Clint's assessment. Curtis and Dee were victims in Paula's game, not willing conspirators. They'd been manipulated and coached, but their fundamental loyalty remained intact. This knowledge influenced Clint's strategic planning. Any operation against Paula and Marshall needed to protect the children while exposing the truth of their mother's deception. As Clint reviewed his accumulated intelligence that evening, the scope of his enemy's vulnerability became clear. Paula and Marshall believed they were executing a simple divorce scheme, but they'd actually exposed themselves to a devastating counterattack. Their communications were compromised, their finances were transparent, and their network of supporters was riddled with Clint's assets. More importantly, they'd underestimated their opponent. Paula saw Clint as a convenient target, stable enough to provide financial security, but passive enough to be discarded when someone better came along. Marshall viewed him as just another obstacle to be removed through manipulation and legal maneuvering. Neither of them understood that they were facing a man who'd spent years hunting enemy operatives across hostile territory. Clint had survived combat not through superior firepower, but through superior intelligence and patience. He understood how to identify enemy weaknesses, exploit them systematically, and destroy his opponent's capacity to threaten him. The game was entering its next phase, and Clint's enemies were about to learn that their carefully constructed plans had been compromised from the beginning. Chapter 4: The Network Activation. Clint's war room had expanded beyond his basement. Safe houses, dead drops, and communication protocols, the infrastructure of a covert operation, now spanned across Denver's metropolitan area. His enemies had declared war using lawyers and social manipulation. Clint would respond using skills they'd never seen coming. Marshall Chamberlain's confidence was about to become his weakness. The fitness instructor had grown careless, believing his charm and Alice Yu's legal strategy made him untouchable. He'd been bragging to his inner circle about his score with Paula, describing Clint as another weak military boy who thinks his service entitles him to respect. Clint's first target was Marshall's professional reputation, the foundation of his entire operation. Through Saul cyber intelligence, Clint had identified the 4 other married women Marshall was simultaneously pursuing. Each believed she was special, that Marshall genuinely cared about her beyond his professional services. Janice Ross, wife of a prominent orthopedic surgeon, had been meeting Marshall for specialized training sessions for 6 months. Dr. Ross worked long hours and trusted his wife completely, never questioning her sudden dedication to fitness. Marshall had convinced Janice that her marriage was unfulfilling and that she deserved someone who appreciated her inner beauty. Teresa Little was married to a successful real estate developer and had been financing Marshall's lifestyle through training equipment purchases that actually funded his expensive tastes. Teresa believed Marshall was developing a revolutionary fitness program that would make them both wealthy once he left his current gym. Marie Sawyer's husband was a prominent attorney at one of Denver's most prestigious firms. Marshall had been cultivating Marie for over a year, gradually introducing her to the idea that her husband's long hours indicated he was having an affair. Marie was already consulting with Alice about divorce options, believing she was getting ahead of her husband's anticipated betrayal. Clint's strategy was elegant in its simplicity. He would make Marshall's multiple deceptions collide simultaneously, destroying the fitness instructor's credibility and exposing his operation to all his victims at once. The trap required perfect timing and coordination. Clint enlisted Andy Long, a former Marine sniper who now worked as a freelance photographer, to document Marshall's activities. Andy's military precision and civilian photography skills made him ideal for surveillance operations. Target follows the same pattern every week, Andy reported after 10 days of observation. Tuesday morning with Ross at the downtown gym. Tuesday evening with your wife at the Cherry Creek location. Thursday afternoon with Little at his private studio. Thursday evening with Sawyer at her country club. The pattern revealed Marshall's operational security weakness. He was using the same cover stories and meeting locations repeatedly, assuming his victims would never communicate with each other. Clint's disruption plan began with anonymous information delivered to each woman's husband. Not accusations or emotional appeals, but simple factual evidence. Photographs of their wives with Marshall, copies of financial transactions, and schedules showing the pattern of deception. Dr. Ross received copies of hotel receipts and photographs of Janice leaving Marshall's apartment building. The evidence was delivered to his office with a note reading simply, "Tuesday evenings, your wife isn't at book club." Teresa Little's husband found detailed financial records showing thousands of dollars in transfers to Marshall's accounts, along with photographs of Teresa and Marshall at restaurants during times she claimed to be shopping. Marie Sawyer's attorney husband received the most damaging package. Copies of Alice used preliminary divorce strategy documents that had been prepared for Marie, along with recordings of conversations where Marshall encouraged Marie to believe her husband was unfaithful. But the most devastating blow came through a coordinated revelation at Marshall's gym. Clint had arranged for all four women to discover each other's existence simultaneously. Using social engineering techniques learned in military intelligence, Clint manipulated the women's schedules to create an unavoidable collision. He placed anonymous calls to each woman, claiming to be a gym employee calling to confirm their appointment changes that would bring them to the same location at the same time. Andy positioned himself with long-range photography equipment as the drama unfolded. Janice Ross arrived first for what she believed was a private session with Marshall. Teresa Little appeared next, confused about her rescheduled appointment. Marie Sawyer arrived expecting to meet Marshall for lunch. Finally, Paula arrived for what she thought was an emergency session to discuss her divorce strategy. The confrontation was explosive. For women who'd each believed they were Marshall's only special client, suddenly faced each other in the gym's lobby. Marshall's attempts to explain the situation only made things worse, as each woman realized the extent of his deception. Janice Ross, a normally reserved woman, began screaming about the money she'd given Marshall for equipment purchases. Teresa Little demanded to know why Marshall had been telling her that Janice was just a client when they were obviously having an affair. Marie Sawyer confronted Paula directly, asking why Marshall had told her that Paula was desperate and unstable. Paula's reaction was the most devastating to observe. Her face cycled through confusion, denial, anger, and finally crushing humiliation as she realized that Marshall had been manipulating her exactly as he'd manipulated the others. The man she destroyed her marriage for had never seen her as anything more than another source of income. Marshall's attempts to maintain control of the situation failed completely. His smooth charm evaporated under the combined assault of four angry women who finally understood how they'd been used. When he tried to blame Clint for orchestrating the confrontation, Paula's response silenced him completely. "Clint doesn't even know where I am," she screamed. You told me he was dangerous and controlling. But you're the one who's been controlling everything. Andy's photographs captured every moment of Marshall's professional destruction. By evening, the images would be circulating through Denver's fitness community along with detailed accounts of Marshall's systematic deception of married clients. But Clint's operation was just beginning. Marshall's exposure was phase one, a larger strategy designed to dismantle the entire network that had conspired against him. Alice Yu's law practice would be next, followed by the systematic destruction of everyone who'd participated in the campaign to destroy Clint's reputation. The fitness instructor who'd thought he was master manipulator had just learned that he'd been outmaneuvered by a professional. Marshall's confidence was shattered, his income sources eliminated, and his reputation destroyed. But more importantly, Paula had witnessed the complete collapse of the man she'd trusted over her husband. The psychological impact on Paula was exactly what Clint had calculated. She was now questioning everything Marshall had told her about Clint, everything she believed about her marriage, and everything she'd planned for her future. The man she betrayed her family for had been revealed as a predator who saw her as nothing more than another victim. Marshall Chamberlain had awakened a sleeping giant, and now that giant was methodically dismantling everything Marshall had built. But this was still just the opening phase of Clint's campaign for justice. Chapter 5. The Psychological War. The destruction of Marshall's operation had sent shockwaves through Denver's affluent social circles. But Clint understood that psychological warfare required sustained pressure. His enemies needed to experience the slow, grinding realization that their situation was hopeless, that every move they made only deepened their predicament. Paula's world was collapsing in stages. The revelation of Marshall's deception had shattered her confidence. But worse was coming as the financial reality of her situation became clear. Moving in with Rosemary was supposed to be temporary, but Paula's legal bills were mounting while her access to Clint's income had been severed by the restraining order she'd filed. Alice Yu, the divorce attorney Paula had trusted with her future, was now revealing her true priorities. With Marshall's credibility destroyed and his testimony worthless, Yu informed Paula that her case had become significantly more difficult. The evidence of Paula's affair was overwhelming, and her initial claims of abuse now appeared vindictive rather than legitimate. "We need to adjust our strategy," Yu explained during a tense meeting at her downtown office. "Your husband's evidence suggests careful planning on his part. We're dealing with someone who understands how to protect his assets and discredit his accusers." Paula's desperation was evident as she pleaded for options. "You said this would be simple. You said judges always side with the wife in these situations." "That's true when the wife is credible," you replied coldly. "Your husband has made you appear to be a calculating adulteress who planned to falsely accuse him of domestic violence. That changes everything." What Paula didn't know was that Alice Yu's law practice was also under systematic attack. Clint had identified patterns in Yu's cases, a history of representing women who made abuse allegations that couldn't be substantiated, but which generated substantial legal fees and favorable settlements for Yu's clients. Eric Robbins had been building cases against Yu's questionable practices for weeks. As a licensed private investigator, Eric had access to court records and could legally investigate Yu's professional conduct. The pattern he discovered was damning. Yu specialized in manufacturing domestic violence claims against wealthy men, using emotional manipulation and coach testimony to extract maximum settlements. "She's done this at least 12 times in the past 3 years," Eric reported to Clint during their weekly briefing. "Same pattern every time. Wealthy woman has an affair, comes to you for divorce representation, suddenly discovers she's been emotionally abused by her husband." Clint's response was characteristically thorough. He'd identified 3 of Yu's former clients whose ex-husbands had been destroyed by false allegations. These men had lost custody of their children, paid enormous settlements, and seen their reputations ruined by accusations they couldn't disprove. Carl Mansfield had been Yu's victim 2 years earlier. His ex-wife had claimed emotional abuse after being caught in an affair with her tennis instructor. Despite no evidence of actual abuse, Carl had lost primary custody of his 2 young daughters and been ordered to pay 70% of his income in alimony and child support. Marvin Mason had suffered similar destruction 6 months ago. His wife's affair with her personal trainer had somehow transformed into a narrative about Carl's controlling behavior and psychological intimidation. The judge had believed Yu's carefully constructed case, and Marvin now saw his children every other weekend while supporting his ex-wife's luxurious lifestyle. Herbert Dunn had been Yu's most recent victim before Paula. His wife's midlife crisis and affair with a younger man had been reframed as an escape from Herbert's oppressive marriage. Herbert lost his house, his business assets, and meaningful contact with his teenage sons. Clint's strategy was to unite these destroyed men in a coordinated legal assault against Yu's practice. Each man had evidence of Yu's pattern of manufacturing abuse claims, and together they could demonstrate systematic fraud that would destroy Yu's career and potentially result in criminal charges. "You're offering us something we never thought we'd have," Carl told Clint during their first meeting. "The chance to fight back against the system that destroyed us." The three men were eager to cooperate, providing detailed documentation of Yu's tactics and testimony about how their cases had been manipulated. More importantly, they had financial resources to fund an extended legal battle against Yu's practice. While building the case against Alice Yu, Clint was also applying psychological pressure to the McElroy family. Herbert's Thanksgiving triumph had turned to bitter embarrassment as the truth about Paula's deception spread through their social circle. The automotive dealer who'd prided himself on reading people had been completely fooled by his own daughter. Rosemary served as Clint's intelligence source within the family, reporting on the growing tensions and Herbert's increasingly desperate attempts to salvage the situation. The old man had initially supported Paula's divorce plans, but Marshall's exposure and the mounting legal costs were changing his perspective. "Dad's starting to ask difficult questions," Rosemary reported during one of their discreet meetings. "He keeps saying Paula should have talked to him before filing for divorce. He's also asking why she never mentioned problems with you before Marshall appeared." The psychological pressure on Curtis and Dee was Clint's most delicate operation. He needed to extract them from Paula's influence without appearing to violate the restraining order or engaging in the kind of manipulation that had destroyed their trust. Clint's approach was indirect but effective. He arranged for Curtis's wrestling coach, a man who respected Clint's military background, to reach out to the teenager. Coach Neil Hoffman had noticed Curtis's declining performance and attitude since the family separation. "Your boy's struggling," Hoffman told Clint during a carefully arranged conversation. "He won't talk about what's happening at home, but he's lost his focus completely. Whatever's going on, it's destroying his confidence." Clint provided Hoffman with context about the situation, not accusations against Paula, but simple facts about the family's circumstances and Clint's desire to maintain a relationship with the children he'd tried to raise. Hoffman's military background gave him insight into Clint's character, and he became an advocate for reconciliation. During team meetings and private conversations, he spoke about the importance of loyalty, the value of father figures, and the damage caused by family divisions. The coach's influence on Curtis was significant. Wrestling required discipline and respect for authority, qualities that Clint had tried to instill in the boy. Hoffman's validation of those values created cognitive dissonance with Paula's narrative about Clint being dangerous or controlling. Dee's extraction required a different approach. Clint remembered her love of mathematics and her dreams of becoming an engineer. Through Saul's research, he identified a prestigious summer engineering program for high school students that Dee would find irresistible. The application required a recommendation from a mentor or family member who understands the student's potential. Clint submitted a detailed letter describing Dee's mathematical abilities, her curiosity about how things work, and her potential for success in engineering. When Dee received notification of her acceptance to the program, she was confused about who had recommended her. Rosemary mentioned that the application had been submitted by someone who really believes in your potential, without revealing Clint's identity. The psychological impact on Dee was exactly what Clint had intended. She began questioning why someone would invest time and effort in her future if that person was truly dangerous or uncaring. The cognitive dissonance between Paula's claims and Clint's demonstrated support created doubt about everything she'd been told. Meanwhile, Marshall's desperation was escalating. His income had disappeared with the exposure of his operation. His reputation in Denver's fitness community was destroyed, and the women he'd manipulated were now threatening legal action against him. Marshall's response was predictably emotional and self-destructive. He began calling Paula obsessively, alternating between apologies and accusations. He blamed Clint for orchestrating his downfall, then blamed Paula for not being smart enough to avoid detection. These conversations, which Rosemary overheard and reported to Clint, revealed Marshall's true character. The smooth charm had been replaced by desperate manipulation and barely contained rage. Paula was finally seeing the man behind the facade, angry, entitled, and completely self-centered. "He's been calling her every hour," Rosemary reported. "Yesterday, he screamed at her for 20 minutes about how she'd ruined his life by being careless." Paula was crying after the call, asking me if she'd made a terrible mistake. The psychological pressure was achieving its intended effect. Paula's confidence in her decisions was crumbling as she realized the extent of Marshall's deception and manipulation. Alice Yu's increasingly expensive legal bills were straining her finances, and her family's support was wavering as the truth became undeniable. But Clint's campaign was far from over. Phase 5 had been psychological warfare designed to isolate his enemies and destroy their confidence. Phase 6 would be their complete destruction, using the legal system and social pressure to ensure they could never threaten him or anyone else again. The hunters had become the hunted, and they were beginning to understand that they'd chosen the wrong prey. Chapter 6: The Legal Crucible. 6 weeks after the Thanksgiving revelation, Clint's legal counteroffensive was ready to launch. His enemies had made the critical error of believing the American legal system favored emotion over evidence. They were about to learn that superior preparation and documentation could devastate even the most sympathetic narrative. Alice Yu's law practice was the first target for systematic destruction. The coalition of Yu's previous victims, Carl Mansfield, Marvin Mason, and Herbert Dunn, had compiled devastating evidence of her pattern of fraud. Together with Clint's intelligence on her current operations, they'd build a case that would end Yu's career and potentially result in criminal charges. The assault began with a formal complaint to the Colorado Bar Association, detailing Yu's systematic manufacture of domestic violence claims. The complaint included pattern analysis showing how you coach clients to make identical accusations, financial records proving she profited from prolonged litigation, and recorded conversations where you had discussed strategies for maximizing emotional impact on judges. Carl Mansfield, who'd lost his children to Yu's manipulation, provided the most damaging testimony. His ex-wife had eventually admitted that you had coached her to embellish claims of emotional abuse, teaching her specific phrases and behaviors that would convince judges of her victimization. Alice told me that judges want to see fear. Carl's ex-wife testified in a sworn affidavit. "She taught me how to cry on command, how to appear intimidated when my ex-husband was in the room. She said it didn't matter if the abuse was real as long as it felt real to the judge." Marvin Mason contributed evidence of Yu's financial manipulation tactics. You had encouraged his ex-wife to hide assets, inflate expenses, and create artificial financial need to maximize alimony settlements. When Marvin's ex-wife had expressed doubt about these strategies, you had assured her that the system is designed to protect women, so we're just using available tools. Herbert Dunn's case provided evidence of Yu's most sophisticated operation, the systematic destruction of father-child relationships through coached accusations of inappropriate behavior. You had taught his ex-wife to reinterpret normal father-child interactions as signs of psychological damage, creating a narrative that made Dunn appear dangerous to his own sons. The Bar Association complaint was supplemented by a civil lawsuit alleging fraud, malpractice, and conspiracy. Clint's military pension provided sufficient resources to fund extended litigation, and Yu's other victims contributed both financial support and additional evidence. Yu's initial response was characteristic of her aggressive approach. She accused her male victims of coordinating a harassment campaign designed to silence a successful female attorney. But this strategy backfired when investigators discovered that Yu had made identical accusations against every man who complained about her practices. Alice Yu's pattern is consistent, the Bar Association investigator noted in his preliminary report. When challenged about her methods, she immediately claims gender-based persecution. This response appears to be calculated rather than genuine. While Yu's professional destruction proceeded through official channels, Clint was simultaneously dismantling Marshall's remaining resources and reputation. The fitness instructor's desperate attempts to rebuild his career had been systematically sabotaged through Clint's network of military and law enforcement contacts. Marshall had attempted to establish a new personal training business, but prospective clients received anonymous warnings about his history of inappropriate relationships with married women. Gyms that considered hiring him discovered detailed accounts of his sexual misconduct and financial manipulation of clients. More devastating was the coordinated legal assault from Marshall's previous victims. Janice Ross, Teresa Little, and Marie Sawyer had united to file civil lawsuits against Marshall for fraud, sexual misconduct, and emotional distress. Each woman could document thousands of dollars in financial losses and systematic psychological manipulation. Marshall's defense strategy revealed his true character. Rather than accepting responsibility for his actions, he attempted to blame his victims for seducing him and willingly giving him money. His attorney, a desperate bottom feeder attracted by the promise of quick payment, encouraged Marshall to portray himself as the victim of aggressive older women. This strategy was disastrous. The three women were accomplished professionals with credible reputations, while Marshall was an unemployed fitness instructor with no assets and a history of targeting married women. His claims of being seduced appeared ridiculous in the face of evidence, showing his systematic approach to manipulation. But the most devastating blow to Marshall came from an unexpected source. His former girlfriend, Dee Archer, who'd been discarded 6 months earlier when Marshall began pursuing Paula. Dee had remained silent about Marshall's abusive behavior during their relationship, but his public attempts to portray himself as a victim triggered her decision to speak out. Dee provided evidence of Marshall's pattern of emotional and financial abuse. He'd isolated her from friends and family, controlled her finances, and used psychological manipulation to maintain dominance over their relationship. When she'd attempted to leave, Marshall had threatened to destroy her reputation and career. Marshall's entire identity is built on controlling women, Dee testified in a sworn affidavit. He studies their weaknesses, exploits their insecurities, and convinces them that he's their salvation. When they're no longer useful, he discards them and moves on to the next victim. Dee's testimony was particularly damaging because it established Marshall's predatory pattern years before he'd encountered Paula. This evidence demolished any claim that Marshall's relationship with Paula was genuine romance rather than calculated manipulation. The legal pressure on Paula was equally systematic but more psychologically complex. Clint's divorce attorney, Raphael Lee, was a former military lawyer who understood both the emotional and strategic dimensions of family law. Lee's approach was methodical: document everything, admit nothing, and force Paula to prove her accusations under oath. Paula's initial divorce petition had been built on Alice Yu's aggressive strategy: claim emotional abuse, demand immediate custody and support, and rely on judicial sympathy for distressed women. But with Yu's credibility destroyed and Marshall's manipulation exposed, Paula's case had become untenable. "Your wife made a critical error," Lee explained to Clint during their strategy session. "She filed accusations of abuse without evidence, believing the court would accept her word over yours. Now she's committed to a narrative she can't support while you have documentation of her systematic deception." Lee's counterattack was devastating. Rather than simply defending against Paula's accusations, he filed an aggressive response documenting Paula's adultery, her conspiracy with Marshall and Yu to make false abuse claims, and her alienation of Clint's relationship with the children. The financial analysis was particularly damaging to Paula's position. Clint had contributed over $200,000 to the marriage through home improvements, children's education, and lifestyle expenses. Paula had contributed virtually nothing financially while systematically planning to claim the majority of marital assets through false accusations. The evidence suggests calculated fraud rather than marital breakdown, Lee argued in his response. Mrs. Hodges began planning her husband's destruction more than a year ago while accepting his financial support and presenting herself as a loving wife. But Clint's most effective legal strategy involved the children. Rather than fighting for custody through traditional channels, he documented Paula's systematic alienation of his relationship with Curtis and Dee. The evidence included recordings of Paula coaching the children to avoid Clint, financial records showing she'd used child-related expenses to fund her affair, and testimony from teachers and coaches about the children's declining performance since the separation. Curtis's wrestling coach, Neil Hoffman, provided particularly damaging testimony about Paula's manipulation of her son. Hoffman had witnessed Paula telling Curtis that Clint didn't really care about him, and that his wrestling success wasn't important to someone who wasn't his real father. The boy was devastated, Hoffman testified. He went from being a confident young man to questioning everything about himself. His mother was systematically destroying his relationship with the only stable father figure he'd ever known. Dee's mathematics teacher, a woman who'd worked with the girl for 2 years, provided similar testimony about Paula's psychological manipulation. She'd overheard Paula telling Dee that Clint's support for her engineering dreams was just manipulation, and that men like him only pretend to care when they want something. The combined legal pressure on Paula, Marshall, and Alice was achieving its intended effect. Their confidence was shattered, their resources were depleted, and their support systems were crumbling under the weight of evidence. But more importantly, the truth was finally emerging through official channels that couldn't be dismissed or manipulated. Clint's enemies had believed they could destroy him through false accusations and social manipulation. Instead, they'd learned that careful preparation and systematic documentation could turn their own tactics against them. The legal crucible was refining truth from deception, and Clint's enemies were discovering that justice, when properly pursued, was far more devastating than revenge. Chapter 7. The Turning Point. The courthouse steps of Denver's family court building had witnessed countless domestic dramas, but few as systematically devastating as the proceedings that would determine the fate of Paula Hodges' accusations against her husband. 2 months of legal maneuvering had created a perfect storm of evidence that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. Alice's career was in free fall. The Bar Association investigation had uncovered a pattern of misconduct spanning 5 years and involving dozens of clients. Her law license was suspended pending criminal investigation, and her former clients were discovering that their cases had been built on manufactured evidence and coach testimony. The revelation sent shockwaves through Denver's legal community. 3 prominent divorces that you had won through abuse allegations were now under review, with judges questioning whether they'd been manipulated into making decisions based on false evidence. The implications are staggering, admitted Judge Gary Shea, who'd presided over 2 of Yu's fraudulent cases. If these allegations are proven, it means we've been systematically deceived by an officer of the court who weaponized domestic violence claims for financial gain. Marshall Chamberlain's situation had deteriorated from embarrassing to catastrophic. The civil lawsuits from his victims had evolved into criminal charges as prosecutors discovered evidence of systematic fraud and sexual exploitation. District Attorney Jesse Martin announced that Marshall would face charges including fraud, sexual misconduct, and conspiracy to commit perjury. This defendant operated a sophisticated scheme designed to exploit vulnerable women for financial gain, Martin stated at a press conference. He targeted married women, encouraged affairs, then participated in destroying their families through false legal claims. Marshall's attempts to flee Denver had been thwarted by Clint's network. When Marshall tried to leave the state, Deputy Lee Keenan had been waiting with an arrest warrant. The fitness instructor who'd once moved confidently through Denver's social circles was now facing years in prison. But the most dramatic transformation was occurring within the McElroy family itself. Herbert's initial support for Paula had evaporated as evidence of her deception mounted. The automotive dealer who'd prided himself on reading people felt humiliated by how completely his daughter had fooled him. "I keep thinking about that Thanksgiving dinner," Herbert admitted to Rosemary during a private conversation she later reported to Clint. "I treated Clint like garbage based on Paula's lies. I believed my own daughter was a victim when she was actually the predator." Herbert's change of heart had profound implications for Paula's case. Her primary source of financial and emotional support was now questioning everything she'd told him about her marriage. Worse, Herbert was beginning to remember conversations and incidents that contradicted Paula's narrative of abuse. She never mentioned problems with Clint until Marshall appeared, Herbert realized during a painful family meeting. For 2 years, she talked about how stable Clint was, how good he was with the children, how lucky she felt to have found someone so reliable. The psychological pressure on Paula was becoming unbearable. Her support system had collapsed, her legal representation had been discredited, and her children were beginning to question everything she'd told them about Clint. Curtis had been the first to break. The teenager's growing understanding of adult relationships made Paula's manipulation increasingly obvious. When he'd asked direct questions about her affair with Marshall, Paula's defensive responses had confirmed his suspicions. "You lied to me," Curtis confronted his mother during a heated argument at Rosemary's house. "You told me Clint was dangerous, but Marshall was the one treating you badly. You made me hate someone who was trying to help me." Dee's revelation was even more devastating. The girl's mathematical mind had begun analyzing the timeline of events, and she discovered inconsistencies in Paula's story that proved her mother had been planning the divorce long before any alleged abuse occurred. "You were texting Marshall about leaving Dad before you ever claimed he was being mean to you," Dee accused, confronting Paula with evidence she'd gathered. "You're lying about everything, and you used us to help you do it." The children's rebellion against Paula's narrative was Clint's most significant victory. Curtis and Dee were beginning to remember the stability and support Clint had provided, contrasting it with the chaos and uncertainty their mother's decisions had created. But the final blow to Paula's case came from an unexpected source: her own recorded conversations with Alice Yu. As part of the criminal investigation into Yu's practice, prosecutors had obtained recordings of attorney-client conversations where Yu had coached Paula to embellish abuse claims. In one particularly damaging recording, Yu was heard telling Paula, "You need to sound more frightened when you talk about him." Judges respond to fear, not anger. Practice looking intimidated when he's in the room. Another recording captured Paula expressing doubt about making false accusations. "I don't think Clint ever actually threatened me. He was just quiet and distant after he found out about Marshall." Yu's response was chilling. Distance is a form of psychological abuse. We can frame his withdrawal as intimidation. The judge won't know the difference. These recordings demolished any remaining credibility Paula might have retained. Her own words proved that she participated in manufacturing abuse claims under Yu's guidance, targeting a man who'd supported her family financially and emotionally for years. The courtroom atmosphere was tense as Judge Alex Boyer prepared to rule on Paula's motions for emergency custody and support. Boyer was known for his methodical approach to family law and his intolerance for deception. Paula's new attorney, a desperate replacement hired after Yu's suspension, attempted to salvage the case by arguing that Paula had been manipulated by unscrupulous professionals and shouldn't be held responsible for their misconduct. This strategy backfired spectacularly. Judge Boyer's response was withering. "Mrs. Hodges is an adult who made conscious decisions to participate in filing false accusations against her husband. The court will not excuse perjury simply because she received bad legal advice." Clint's attorney, Raphael Lee, methodically presented evidence of Paula's systematic deception: financial records, communication logs, testimony from witnesses, and Paula's own recorded admissions created an overwhelming case that she'd conspired to destroy her husband through false accusations. "Your Honor," Lee argued, "this case represents something far more serious than marital breakdown. It demonstrates calculated fraud perpetrated against both this court and Mr. Hodges. Mrs. Hodges participated in a conspiracy to weaponize domestic violence allegations for financial gain. Judge Boyer's ruling was swift and comprehensive. Paula's accusations of abuse were dismissed as unsupported by evidence and contradicted by substantial proof of fabrication. Her requests for custody and support were denied, pending a full investigation of her misconduct. More significantly, Boyer ordered an investigation into whether Paula should face criminal charges for perjury and filing false police reports. The judge's language left no doubt about his assessment of Paula's credibility. This court has been presented with clear evidence that Mrs. Hodges participated in manufacturing false accusations of domestic violence, Boyer stated. Such conduct not only victimizes the accused spouse, but undermines the credibility of legitimate abuse victims. The court will ensure that appropriate authorities investigate Mrs. Hodges' potential criminal liability. The courtroom erupted as Boyer's words sank in. Paula's remaining supporters realized that she now faced potential criminal prosecution, while Clint's vindication was complete and public. But for Clint, this legal victory was only the beginning of a larger reckoning. His enemies had chosen to destroy him through false accusations and systematic manipulation. Their defeat in court was satisfying, but it wasn't sufficient justice for the harm they'd attempted to cause. The legal system had protected Clint from his enemy's immediate attack, but couldn't undo the damage they'd tried to inflict on his reputation, his relationships with the children, and his faith in the people he'd tried to love. True justice would require a more personal accounting, and Clint was prepared to collect it with the same methodical precision he'd applied to their legal destruction. Chapter 8: The Reckoning. The legal victory had cleared Clint's name and exposed his enemy's deception, but hadn't satisfied his deeper need for justice. Paula, Marshall, and their conspirators had attempted to destroy not just his marriage, but his reputation, his relationship with the children, and his faith in the fundamental decency of human relationships. Legal vindication was necessary, but insufficient. True reckoning required something more personal and permanent. Marshall Chamberlain's criminal trial had become Denver's most watched legal proceeding in years. The fitness instructor who'd once charmed his way through the city's social circles now sat in an orange jumpsuit, facing 15 felony charges including fraud, sexual misconduct, and conspiracy to commit perjury. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Testimony from his victims painted a picture of systematic predation spanning years, with Marshall targeting vulnerable married women and manipulating them into relationships that destroyed their families and finances. The evidence included recorded conversations, financial records, and detailed accounts of psychological manipulation. But Clint had ensured that Marshall's punishment would extend beyond legal consequences. Using his network of military and law enforcement contacts, Clint had arranged for Marshall to be housed with inmates who had particular contempt for men who preyed on women and destroyed families. Word travels fast in lockup, Deputy Lee Keenan reported during one of his informal updates to Clint. Guys inside don't appreciate predators who target wives and mothers. Marshall's having a rough time adjusting to his new environment. Marshall's attempts to maintain his confident facade crumbled under the relentless pressure of prison life. The smooth-talking manipulator discovered that his charm was worthless among men who saw through his performance and judged him by actions rather than words. Alice Yu's destruction was even more systematic. The disbarred attorney faced not only criminal charges, but civil lawsuits from every family she'd helped destroy through manufactured abuse claims. Her law practice had been liquidated to pay damages, and her reputation was so thoroughly ruined that she'd been forced to leave Denver entirely. But Clint's most thorough revenge was reserved for Paula herself. The legal system had vindicated him and exposed her lies, but Paula's social and financial destruction was still unfolding according to Clint's carefully orchestrated plan. Herbert McElroy's complete withdrawal of support had left Paula financially devastated. The automotive dealer had not only stopped funding her legal bills, but demanded repayment of money he'd advanced for her divorce case. Herbert's humiliation at being deceived by his own daughter had transformed his disappointment into active hostility. She made me complicit in destroying a good man. Herbert told Rosemary in a conversation she reported to Clint. I'll never forgive her for using me as a weapon against someone who was trying to love our family. Paula's attempts to rebuild her social standing had been systematically sabotaged by the truth of her actions. The women who'd once envied her seemingly perfect marriage now gossiped about her affair and false accusations. Former friends avoided her, unwilling to associate with someone who'd weaponized domestic violence claims for personal gain. The children's complete rejection of Paula was perhaps the most devastating consequence of her choices. Curtis and Dee had moved back home with Clint, requesting that the court terminate their mother's custody rights entirely. She used us as weapons against you, Curtis explained to Clint during their first private conversation after the legal proceedings ended. She taught us to hate someone who was trying to love us. I can't forgive that. Dee's mathematical mind had analyzed the situation with characteristic precision. She calculated that destroying you would benefit her financially. She treated our family like a business transaction. That's not love, that's sociopathy. The children's rejection of Paula was particularly painful because it was based on logical analysis rather than emotional manipulation. They'd seen through their mother's deception and made rational decisions about who deserved their loyalty and trust. Paula's attempts to rebuild relationships with Curtis and Dee were met with polite but firm rejection. The teenagers had learned to recognize manipulation tactics and refused to be drawn back into their mother's web of deception. You had a choice between honesty and manipulation, Dee told Paula during their final conversation. You chose to lie to us about everything that mattered. We can't trust you anymore. But Clint's most sophisticated revenge was still unfolding through long-term consequences that Paula was only beginning to understand. Her false accusations had created a permanent record that would follow her through any future relationships or legal proceedings. Employment opportunities had evaporated as background checks revealed her involvement in filing false domestic violence claims. Potential employers in Denver's close-knit professional community had heard about her case and decided they couldn't risk hiring someone with such questionable character. Dating had become equally challenging as men in Paula's social circle were aware of her history of false accusations and systematic manipulation. Her reputation preceded her in ways that made forming new relationships virtually impossible. Who would want to date someone who tried to destroy her husband through false abuse claims? One of Paula's former friends had commented publicly. How could any man trust someone like that? The social isolation was devastating for someone like Paula, who'd built her identity around social status and family connections. The woman who'd once been the center of attention at family gatherings was now an unwelcome reminder of poor judgment and moral compromise. Financially, Paula's situation had become desperate. Without family support, employment prospects, or potential romantic partners, she'd been forced to move into a modest apartment and take part-time work in retail, a dramatic decline from the comfortable lifestyle Clint had provided. The contrast between her current circumstances and the life she destroyed was a daily reminder of the cost of her betrayal. Every financial struggle, every lonely evening, every reminder of her damaged reputation was a consequence of choosing manipulation over honesty, greed over loyalty. But perhaps the most profound element of Clint's revenge was psychological. Paula was now experiencing the same isolation and helplessness she tried to inflict on him through false accusations. She understood what it felt like to have her reputation destroyed, her support system eliminated, and her future prospects devastated. She's finally learning what it means to be truly alone, Rosemary reported during one of her conversations with Clint. She keeps saying she never realized how much damage she was trying to cause until it happened to her. Marshall's imprisonment, Yu's disbarment, and Paula's social destruction had created a powerful deterrent effect throughout Denver's professional community. The case had become a cautionary tale about the consequences of false accusations and systematic manipulation. Other attorneys were more careful about accepting cases built on questionable abuse claims. Personal trainers were more professional in their relationships with married clients. Most importantly, potential false accusers understood that their tactics could be thoroughly investigated and completely exposed. Clint's methodical destruction of his enemies had achieved something beyond personal satisfaction. It had created systemic change that would protect other potential victims of similar schemes. But the most meaningful victory was the restoration of his relationships with Curtis and Dee. The children who'd been turned against him through manipulation had returned with deeper appreciation for his stability, honesty, and genuine care for their well-being. "You never try to make us choose sides," Curtis observed during one of their evening conversations. "Even when Mom was poisoning us against you, you just kept being there for us. That's real love." Dee's engineering mind had drawn similar conclusions. "You solved this problem by gathering evidence and presenting facts. You never lied to us or tried to manipulate our emotions. That's how I want to approach challenges in my own life." The children's respect and affection was Clint's greatest victory, more satisfying than any legal judgment or social revenge. They'd learned valuable lessons about loyalty, honesty, and the difference between manipulation and genuine love. As Clint reflected on the complete destruction of his enemies, he felt no guilt or regret. They'd chosen to attack him through deception and false accusations, threatening not only his freedom, but his relationships with children he'd tried to love as his own. Their punishment was proportional to their crimes and comprehensive enough to ensure they could never threaten him or anyone else in similar ways. Justice had been served with precision and finality. Chapter 9. The New Foundation. 6 months after the Thanksgiving confrontation that had shattered his world, Clint Hodges stood in his kitchen preparing breakfast for Curtis and Dee, a daily ritual that had become sacred in their rebuilt family structure. The house that had once echoed with tension and deception now hummed with the comfortable rhythms of honest relationships and mutual respect. Paula's complete absence from their lives had initially created a void that Clint worried might damage the children permanently. But Curtis and Dee had adapted with remarkable resilience, demonstrating that healthy young minds could distinguish between authentic love and toxic manipulation when given clear evidence of both. "College applications are due next month," Dee announced over breakfast, her voice bright with excitement about her engineering prospects. "The program director said my recommendation letters are some of the strongest they've received." Clint smiled, remembering the careful cultivation of Dee's academic supporters during the darkest period of their family crisis. Teachers, coaches, and program directors who'd witnessed Clint's genuine investment in Dee's future had become advocates for her college aspirations. Curtis had experienced his own academic and athletic renaissance since Paula's removal from their lives. His wrestling performance had improved dramatically once he'd stopped questioning whether his achievements mattered to his family. Coach Hoffman reported that Curtis was being recruited by several Division I universities. "State championships are next week," Curtis said, his confidence evident in every word. "I've been thinking about what you said. That victory belongs to people who prepare better than their opponents." The philosophy had guided more than Curtis's athletic training. Both children had internalized Clint's lessons about methodical preparation, careful observation, and the importance of evidence over emotion. They were becoming formidable young adults who wouldn't be easily manipulated or deceived. The legal aftermath of Paula's false accusations had created ripple effects throughout Denver's professional community. 3 other women who'd filed questionable domestic violence claims had withdrawn their accusations rather than face the scrutiny that Alice Yu's exposure had generated. The family court system had implemented new protocols for investigating abuse allegations, requiring more substantial evidence before accepting restraining orders. "Your case changed everything," Judge Alex Boyer had told Clint during a chance encounter at a veterans charity event. "We're much more careful now about accepting emotional testimony without corroborating evidence. You probably saved dozens of men from similar false accusations." Marshall Chamberlain's prison sentence had been longer than even prosecutors had expected. The fitness instructor was serving 12 years for fraud, sexual misconduct, and conspiracy charges. But more importantly for Clint's sense of justice, Marshall's reputation was so thoroughly destroyed that his future prospects were non-existent. He keeps filing appeals, claiming he was a victim of prosecutorial misconduct, Deputy Lee Keenan had reported during their monthly coffee meetings. "Nobody takes his complaints seriously. Even his fellow inmates consider him a predator. Alice Yu had fled Colorado entirely, her legal career destroyed, and her personal reputation ruined beyond repair. Clint's investigation had revealed that Yu's misconduct extended to other states, triggering additional criminal investigations that would likely result in federal charges. But the most satisfying element of his enemies' destruction was their complete powerlessness to threaten him again. Paula's attempt to rebuild her life had failed at every level: professional, social, and personal. She'd been forced to leave Denver, finding work as a retail clerk in a distant city where her reputation couldn't follow her. Herbert McElroy had attempted reconciliation with Clint several times, but Clint's response had been polite and final. "You showed me who you really are during that Thanksgiving dinner. I don't forget, and I don't forgive betrayal." The old man's humiliation was complete. His carefully constructed image as a successful businessman who could judge character had been destroyed by his daughter's deception and his own gullibility. Herbert's standing in Denver's business community had never recovered from the revelation that he'd been completely fooled by his own child. Rosemary remained the only McElroy family member who maintained contact with Clint and the children, but even that relationship was carefully limited. Clint appreciated her assistance during the crisis, but he'd learned to trust sparingly and verify constantly. The most significant change in Clint's life was his complete rejection of romantic relationships. Paula's betrayal had convinced him that the risk of emotional vulnerability was unacceptable. He'd rebuilt his life around the children, his work, and a carefully selected network of male friends who'd proven their loyalty under pressure. "I don't need someone to complete me," Clint had explained to Saul Hammond during one of their regular military reunions. "I have everything I need: family who earn my trust, work that challenges me, and the satisfaction of having destroyed my enemies completely." Curtis and Dee had initially worried about Clint's social isolation, but they'd come to understand that their stepfather's choice was both rational and final. Paula's betrayal had demonstrated the catastrophic cost of misplaced trust, and Clint had decided that the potential benefits of romantic relationship weren't worth the risks. "You gave everything to Mom, and she tried to destroy you for it," Dee had observed with mathematical precision. "I understand why you won't make that mistake again." The children's education about loyalty, betrayal, and consequences had been thorough and permanent. They'd witnessed firsthand how manipulation tactics worked, how false accusations could be manufactured, and how systematic deception could destroy innocent people. But they'd also learned that careful preparation and methodical response could turn those tactics against their users. "I'll never trust someone just because they claim to love me," Curtis had told Clint during one of their evening conversations. "You taught me to judge people by their actions over time, not their words in the moment." Clint's professional life had also evolved. His security consulting business had expanded significantly as word spread about his investigative abilities and his systematic approach to resolving complex problems. Corporate clients valued his military precision and his demonstrated ability to expose deception and manipulation. "You have a reputation for being thorough and absolutely ruthless with people who try to deceive you," one client had noted. "That's exactly what we need for sensitive corporate investigations." The financial success allowed Clint to secure the children's educational futures while building substantial reserves that would ensure their independence. More importantly, it provided him with resources to continue monitoring and neutralizing potential threats to their rebuilt family. Clint maintained surveillance capabilities that would detect any attempt by Paula, Marshall, or their associates to re-enter their lives. His network of military and law enforcement contacts provided early warning about potential problems, while his documented history of their deception ensured that any future accusations would be immediately discredited. "They're all too afraid to try anything," Eric Robbins had reported during their quarterly security briefings. "Your reputation for systematic retaliation has made you untouchable. Nobody wants to be the next person you decide to destroy." The psychological impact on Clint's enemies had been exactly what he'd intended. They'd learned that attacking him resulted in complete annihilation of their lives, relationships, and future prospects. The lesson had been so thorough that it served as a deterrent to others who might consider similar tactics. As Curtis prepared for his final wrestling match of the season and Dee submitted her college applications, Clint reflected on the price and value of the lessons they'd all learned. Paula's betrayal had cost them their innocence about human nature, but it had given them something more valuable: the knowledge that preparation, evidence, and systematic response could protect them from manipulation and deception. "We're stronger now," Clint told the children during their family dinner. "Not because of what we survived, but because of what we learned about ourselves and each other." Curtis nodded with mature understanding. "You never abandoned us, even when Mom tried to turn us against you. That taught me what real loyalty looks like." Dee's response was characteristically analytical. "You solve an impossible problem through careful planning and patience. You showed us that intelligence and preparation can overcome emotional manipulation." The family they'd built from the wreckage of Paula's deception was stronger than anything they'd lost. It was founded on demonstrated loyalty rather than assumed trust, proven character rather than convenient claims, and shared values that had been tested under pressure. Clint's enemies had sought to destroy him through false accusations and systematic manipulation. Instead, they'd forged him into something more dangerous than they'd ever imagined: a man who understood the true cost of betrayal and was prepared to extract it with mathematical precision from anyone who threatened his family. The war was over, victory was complete, and the new foundation they'd built together was unshakable. Paula, Marshall, and their conspirators had learned too late that some men don't forgive, don't forget, and don't provide second chances to those who choose betrayal over loyalty. Justice had been served, family had been preserved, and the future belonged to those who'd earned it through honesty, preparation, and the courage to fight for what truly mattered. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen, and I'll see you there.